Hello, ladies and gentlemen. 3 months into the war between Israel and Hamas, the army has now entered the third phase of the war. In the north, a clear escalation was registered this week between Israel and Hezbollah after Saleh el-Arouri, deputy leader of Hamas, was killed in a strike on an office in the Dahya neighborhood of Beirut on January 2nd, and after a senior member of Hezbollah's Radwan force was killed yesterday in southern Lebanon. At this hour, in this ever-growing tension between Israel and Hezbollah and the non-stopping launching of rockets by Hezbollah towards both Israeli military and civilian targets, it is left to be seen if whether a diplomatic solution can still be reached, or if the two sides are headed towards yet another military confrontation. Tensions in the north and in the southern fronts, as there are still 136 Israeli young women, small babies, elderly men, and young soldiers held hostage in the dark tunnels of Hamas in Gaza. While focusing daily on issues regarding military preparations and international cooperations to prevent further escalation of the war, much less focus is given to probably the most important subject: the well-being of Israeli society, of Israeli citizens, men, women, children, after the murderous massacre of October 7th on Israeli soil, an event which is already now defined as Israel's most traumatic, deadliest attack it has ever endured. And on a larger scale, the most deadliest event for the whole Jewish world since the Holocaust. What can be said about the resilience of Israelis today? Are there already signs of recovery after this trauma, or is it still too soon to tell? What is needed for a society in trauma to recover and return somehow to what is known in the research as functional continuity? What does it really mean to function after an event in this scale? Is it even possible? I'm Adi Kantor, and to provide some clarity in this very important topic, I have next to me in the INSS studio today retired Brigadier General Dr. Meir Elran, who is a senior researcher and director of the domestic research cluster of the INSS, and who also served in the IDF as a career officer for 24 years in senior command and staff positions, primarily in the Military Intelligence Directorate. And next to him is also Anat Shapira, Neubauer Research Associate at the Terrorism and Low-Intensity Conflict Program of the INSS, and a PhD candidate in the Philosophy Department of Tel Aviv University. A warm welcome to the both of you. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So, Meir, let's start with you. Resilience. What does it even mean? Before we even dive into October 7th and the implications of this event, what is resilience, maybe on an individual level and on a society level?
Okay, so resilience can be lots of things. It can be a metaphor. It can be a buzzword, which is often the case and happening in many countries around the world, but it can also be a strategic frame of action, a guideline for societies and individuals to handle their own lives. Because resilience actually starts with the issue or the challenge of disruptions, man-made disruptions or natural. Exactly. And the big question, and this happens a lot to many systems, and the big problem is what happens following the disruption, and if anything can be done about that. And the answer is yes, there is a lot that can be done about disruptions, how to handle them, how to manage them, and basically how to divert the negative aspects of the disruption into positive trajectories. So basically, when we talk about resilience, we talk about a capacity of a system, and the system can be, as you suggested earlier, can be, individual resilience. It can also be a family or tribe or community or business or a nation as a whole. Some people already start talking about an international resiliency, which is also a very challenging
countries.
Yeah, countries and
coming together.
All together, exactly. And it basically speaks about several phases. Number one, the disruption itself, the magnitude or the impact of the destruction or the disruption. Then the necessary diminishing functionality of the system following the disruption. And then there is a big question: what happens next? If the system is not resilient enough, it might, unfortunately, deteriorate to an extent that it collapses. And things like that happen all the time. But on the other hand, we hope and we aspire, and we can do a lot of things about that to bring a change in the trajectory from the lower point of diminishing resiliency to start bouncing back at least to the preliminary position of functionality that the system had before the disruption, or, and this is a very, very important point, to bring about some kind of a bouncing forward to a higher level of functionality. And of course, what we always aspire, and I think that this is basically the situation in Israel, that after each and every disruption, and we had in our history, not only, the long
the Jewish
history.
World, you mean?
Exactly. Not only in the diaspora, but also since we came back to our homeland, we aspire to face the challenges in such a way that we will grow out of them, that this will be our victory. And this really is the benchmark for our success to manage the disruptions, the quite frequent disruptions that we have. And I would suggest to our viewers that also when we talk about the present war and the entanglement that we found ourselves in, that the big victory for us is that we will bounce forward from that to a higher level of resiliency, of growth, of prosperity, and of stability and peace. I know that this sounds today somewhat far-fetched, but let's start with being a little bit optimistic about that. Let's dream, exactly.
Thank you, Meir. Anat, what are the components, what are the preconditions for a society to be resilient?
So I wouldn't necessarily define them as preconditions, but as you initially said, components, in the idea that there are many different ways of measuring resilience, and obviously there are also a lot of theories about this, but we can see on the one hand emphasis on what we would call value components. So for example, the question of social solidarity, for example, the question of trust in various systems within the state, whether it's the government, the military, the local authority, trust in specific individuals. And then you also have functions which are more measurable, for example, the functionality of the society and the continuity of those functions. So, for example, the ability of people to continue with their daily routines, the ability of people to maintain their work-life balance, the ability of people to maintain their economic standards. So these are less, shall we say, subjective elements and more measurable ones. So these are the various things that all together comprise and can help us even predict sometimes trends within resilience. Our ability to assess how the society, as Meir was pointing out, will respond to the disruption and whether it will be able to bounce back and hopefully also bounce forward.
Okay, so you and Meir gave us really now the infrastructure for now the next questions that I'm about to ask you, which really have to do more with the event itself and what happened here after 6:30 a.m. on October 7th. We are talking about a society that was fragmented a minute before, when we talk about years before, and especially, we're looking back at 2023. This was probably the most difficult year for Israel as a whole, because what we have endured here before October 7th. So there's this element of how to be resilient after such a year of demonstrations in the street, of really fragmented society, that we started from a very, very low place. There's this element. And another element that I'd like you to refer to is also the fact that the Israeli citizens living in kibbutzim next to Gaza went through something that Tel Avivis, for example, didn't. Or people somewhere else in Israel, or for example, people living on the border, on the Lebanese-Israeli border, are in situations in which, for example, people in cities they have it in different ways. We need to take this under consideration. We're talking about people who are still in hotels, who don't have any homes to return to. No school system is working, even though maybe you'd like to refer to the issue of school, if there is somehow a way to come back to some kind of framework, educational framework for the children. So how do we even start addressing this? The fact that it was such a hard year, and that citizens around in this country suffered from different things and still are. Maybe Meir would like to start.
Yeah. Okay. So as always, when we talk about social issues and social science in general, you talk about complex issues. I mean, it's not this or that. It's not binary situation.
Zero, one.
So exactly. So indeed, as you said correctly, Israel found itself on October 7th to be in one of its lowest points in the history of our independence. Because of, the good reasons that we had. We were on the verge of a civil war, let's face it. And it impacted not only the people, the power structure, but also the economy, the daily life, everything. And it also impacted our image on the other side. And definitely this was one of the reasons why Hamas decided to implement their plan to attack us in such a horrific way as they did. So, I mean, October...
Being so weak.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. We were seen by them to be a weak nation. Exactly. And so that was the setting, so to speak, to October 7th, when we really were terribly beaten by the Hamas attack. Barbaric, terrorist, horrific, really heinous kind of an event, which has scarred us and brought about a collective trauma that still exists in Israel.
Yeah, we're still in the event itself.
We are definitely,
we don't have a perspective yet.
Absolutely, we're definitely still in the event, and it's very, very hard for us to understand what's going on. We are confused about the situation, etc., etc. However, and here I want to add something, or to focus on something which is, again, the other side of the picture. And there is another side of the picture. From this awful day of October 7th, we can start seeing very, very significant components of resiliency and of standing up to the challenge immediately after it occurred. And I just want to remind us about those very, very important factors, because I think that they can serve us as a basis for our growth moving forward. First of all, we have to be thankful for the people in the localities of the what we call the Gaza envelope, who were attacked in such a vicious manner. And really, I mean, the numbers are just mind-boggling. The atrocities and all those things, I mean, this is really beyond comprehension.
Beyond words, yeah.
Exactly. But at the same time, they held on. And they held on without the military, without the IDF.
We'll come to the question of
which
trust
shows
in
us,
a bit.
exactly,
Yeah.
which shows us how resilient they have been as individuals,
even
as
before
communities before.
Before, yeah.
Exactly. So that's one very, very bright side of the picture. The second one, I must say, is the fact that the military, which was totally failing to do its basic jobs, it wasn't there, and they didn't expect to, that anything would happen like that. So, I mean, intelligence-wise and operational-wise, it was very, very bad in terms of the performance of the IDF. Who would have believed? But, few days later, the military sort of came up from the shock and in a very, very swift manner transformed itself into an assertive,
offensive
that really is being conducted in the last 3 months in a very, very sophisticated, robust, integrated, and successful manner.
Okay, this is when you talk about the resilience of the army.
Exactly, but it's not just an army, it's the resiliency of the nation, because we're talking about the People's Army. Remember, more than 50% of the soldiers fighting presently inside Gaza are reservists, are people that have been working, studying, teaching, doing their own business.
And left everything.
They left everything, left home, left their families, and came to fight. And this is really an amazing transformation from a very, very low point to a height of performance. Let's face it. This is number two. The third thing that I have to suggest for you is that the spirit of the nation, mostly manifested by the civil society and by, robust and, volunteering projects that hundreds of thousands of people were and still are part of.
I think the more people showed their presence, it showed how less the state was involved.
Exactly.
This was the dissonance between the people and the state that was just not there.
Exactly. So this is
institutions.
This is another thing which is really a very, very promising, proposition. And the last thing I want to say here in this respect is something that might be interesting for our people who do not speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
This is the international support. So we are still today, 3 months after the war started, supported, appreciated, and understood by most of the world, the Western
leaders,
democracies, their leaders, and first and foremost, of course, by the United States and by President Biden and his administration. This is tremendous.
Mm-hmm. And you think
we are not alone.
Helps?
It does help. It not only helps us to a tremendous way in practical ways and in the global arena, etc., but it also bolsters our own resilience. It has an effect of our trust in our capacity
in ourselves,
to handle this awful situation. So from day one or from day two, we managed to make the shift from a very low point to
remarkable.
A start of an incline of a trajectory, and we are still in the process.
Now, thank you very much for this, Meir. Now the question is, Anat, for how long? For how long do you think this can last? This again, I'm returning all the time to the question of trust because I think it's basic. First of all, the trust. Maybe you want to talk a bit about the service that you've conducted. About how do people see the army now, and how long will it last?
So I first actually want to go back to what you asked and the positive trajectory and point out to the fact that, as we've pointed out before, solidarity is one of the strongest components of resilience. And as you pointed out, solidarity was lacking in the Israeli society before this October 7th event.
There was no unity.
However, I think one of the consequences of October 7th is that we were reminded of what unites us as opposed to what divides us. And I think that increased that solidarity within the Israeli society.
What unites us? Hamas?
Unite us, first of all, is the fact that we are under a joint threat. And you were pointing out the differences between people living in the Gaza envelope or on the northern border and the people in Tel Aviv. But Meir's examples of of civil society and of organizations within Israel that rose up to the challenge and provided help precisely to those communities shows that people view us more than anything as one community. And part of the idea is to say that while I individually don't live on the northern border or on Gaza envelope, I still
feel involved.
I feel involved, and I have close interactions with people who share those experiences, which increases our social solidarity. And I think again, and that ties into your question about the trust in the military, is the fact that
in the state as well. In
so
institutions.
I think those two are divided. I will be honest and say this, but I think precisely because so many of us have husbands who are reservists, wives who are reservists,
sons,
brothers, sisters, sons, this increases that social solidarity because of the sense of the threat, but that also increases our trust in the IDF. When the INSS, the Institute, has held surveys, weekly surveys, from the first week to the war and up until last week, pretty much,
Asking
December
what?
31st, various kinds of questions, but one of the things that we measured was the idea of trust. So trust in the IDF in general, trust in the government, trust in the police, but also because trust is such a vague concept that people often struggle to translate it. We've also asked questions such as, do you believe that the objectives, that the IDF is capable of achieving
to reach
the objectives
goals, for example,
of the operation in Gaza? Do you think that the IDF is capable of winning the war in Gaza? Do you think the IDF is capable of winning the war in the north?
And what were the results till now?
So we've seen that overall the trust in the IDF was steadily high throughout the whole period that we were conducting the surveys, approaching 90%, sometimes exceeding it, sometimes slightly below.
And this was a general survey, or that you marked Jewish population, only Jewish population?
Only Jewish population, but, and this is worth pointing out, if you look at different segments within the society, you see that this point about the trust in the IDF is shared by almost all segments of the society, with a slight exception of Haredi Jews, which, to be fair, are also differently exposed to the IDF and differently and are exposed to different media channels. Percentages of people believing in the more specific questions, which also to an extent reflect trust, such as, will the IDF win the war? Will the objectives of the war be achieved? Will the security threat in the Gaza envelope be removed? Were slightly lower, but still consistently high at around 70% throughout most of the time period that we're discussing.
The question is, how long can it still be there? What is the trajectory point where you see, okay, if this and this happens, it's going to get lower?
So I will say...
For how long?
Several things. I will say, on the one hand, what Meir was pointing out earlier about the recovery of the IDF and the operational success that the IDF is achieving in the south right now is a good indicative of that trust continuing. On the other hand, we do have to take into account, and I think this is in part also reflected in the fact that, for example, trust in the government is fairly low. It is between 23 to 26% throughout the period we're discussing. That people
this is
believe,
very low.
Yes. People believe we can't replace the IDF. Even if we were not happy with it, even if we didn't trust it.
What is the alternative?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Which is why people have the need to have trust in the IDF, to believe that the IDF will win. So this is not necessarily
an interesting psychological loop
exactly.
in a way. I'm convincing myself that I have trust.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily a rational choice. The more people get evidence of the irrationality of their choice, and the more we take the time to research and inquire what exactly happened on October 7th. Why did the army fail to provide the alert before things happened? Why was the army absent during the first hour of the fighting?
These questions are asked, but what do we hear from the leaders? It's not the time. It's not the time to discuss it. But they rise from the ground.
They rise, but they are still not very prevalent or dominant in the public discourse. The more they will be, and the more answers will be provided, and we will see the failures that have led, this might lead to a decrease in the trust in the IDF. The more successes we have, and the more we're capable of showing that we have learned the lesson,
and the more goals are reached.
Exactly.
The more goals. But you say, what does it mean to reach a goal? Because at the same time, every day we're counting soldiers who die, and there's a very, I would say, a thin, very sensible balance between reaching a goal and losing sons and daughters.
Let me put it this way: there is a big elephant in the room here, and as Anat suggested very, very correctly, I am not really concerned about the relations between the public and the military. I'm very concerned about the political setting. Yeah. And the problem is that we already see emerging the toxic discourse, the toxic political discourse in our society that divided us before the war started.
In a way, nothing changed.
And this is really, to me, this is really the big question. If I try to answer your question, how long this solidarity will hold, it depends to a huge extent on the capacity of our government either to manage the war in an adequate manner or to dissolve itself. And I'm very clear about that. I think basically that the shock, the trauma, and the consequences of what happened to us necessitate a reshuffle in
everything, basically everything.
Exactly, in everything.
In every
and primarily
term.
in the government. We need to go for an election, for a general election. And then I think if the public will say its word and will make the decision, then this is going to be the time for us to restart this whole Zionist project. Let's put it this way. We have a lot of issues to deal with. We have lots of problems to solve. We have the capacity to do that. We are resilient enough to do that. But in order to grow, in order to sort of structure a new pyramid of strength and resiliency, we need a major political change. And once we do that, and if this happens in 2024, even while the war still goes on in different ways, and we have a new leadership, okay, I think and I believe that we have the capacities, we have the components of resilience that Anat was talking about before to enable us to move forward and to come to the heights that we should be in, considering the needs that we have, not only externally but also internally.
Clear. Yeah, you just summed up actually the discussion, and I do want to give last word to each of you until this happens, and let's hope it happens. Looking at the situation as it is right now, thousands and tens of thousands of people are still in hotels around Israel. Where would you start from, Meir and Anat? Where would you start from helping them? What do they need the most, Meir and then Anat?
Well, I'll say one thing about that. I have a very clear answer to that. They have to be listened to. They have to be appreciated. They have to take their future in their hands. And I think that the people have the senses of what's best for them. And this is something that is very, very difficult to handle here in Israel. The government is over there, with all kind of political considerations, etc., too far away, too attached from the people, and especially the people who have been traumatized to such an extent, mostly those that you mentioned before. You have to remember, we have several groups of, really people who have been, still are in a horrific situation. Number one,
also economic situation.
Not only economic, but also psychological in any other way. Number one, the hostages and their families. This is a major, major issue that has to be solved, and right now it's not being solved. This is number one.
And it's directly related to a resilience of a society.
Absolutely.
Bringing them back.
Absolutely, you're right. Yeah. Number two, we have the people who have been evacuated. We're talking about, more than 150,000 people who are still displaced. They have to have some kind of a solution for that. And then, of course, the reservists and their families. And then, of course, the economy and all that. So this is really a major challenge. But I'm telling you, my belief is, based on my research and the history of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, we can do that.
We will prevail. Anat, last word.
To be fair, Meir sort of stole what I was going to say. I think, putting this from a more personal perspective, people have been denied control over their lives. They've been denied first by Hamas and then by being evacuated to hotels. If we decide for them what is the best way to help them, we deny them that choice and that control again. And I think this is a crucial element in their individual resilience. We've talked a lot about communal and social resilience, but if we talk about individual resilience, regaining that sense of control over your life. You hear the interviews with people in the hotels, and you ask them what you're missing, and they say, I miss doing my own laundry, I miss cooking. These
independence.
Exactly. And making your own choices and being the controller of your own fate. And I think this is why, on top of everything that Meir was saying on a social, communal level, also on an individual level, it is important to consult these people, to make them understand that they are in control
of their
future.
lives. Yes. Meir and Anat, I want to thank you very much for one of the most important discussions we've had here, I think. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for our audience, and see you in the next show.
And
goodbye.
Thank you, Adi.
Thank you.